Linux and politics are two distinct entities, and never the twain shall meet. Well, we'll see about that. Unless you haven't been laser focused on the open source community as of late, you're aware of what's going on with Vaxry, the lead developer of Hyprland, and Free Desktop. Essentially, Vaxry and the Hyprland community have been under scrutiny for some time for basically being unmoderated, believing in, freedom, which has inevitably led to a lot of bigoted stuff going on over there. This culminated a little over a year ago in one individual being misgendered by community members and responding by changing their username to reflect their pronouns, which are they/them. Vaxry responded in his freedom-loving way by forcibly changing that user's name to instead say, "Who cares?" It sort of spiraled from there, and Vaxry's continued lack of respect for the matter has led to Free Desktop exercising its own freedom of association and cutting ties with the Hyprland project. This has led to the open source community erupting on both sides of the matter into discussion about freedom and discussion of politics and where it belongs in the open source world. So of course, I'm also going to weigh in on it. In particular, I want to look at the argument that free and open source software is supposed to be, free, and about freedom, and how politics shouldn't ever come into it. And if you just want my opinion on this matter and don't want to watch the rest of the video because you don't like me very much, rest assured that my opinion is exactly what you think it is. That is, that this argument that freedom as an abstract concept is at the center of FOSS, and that this means that FOSS is inherently apolitical, is absolute dogshit. There, now you can close the tab, now you don't have to watch the rest of the video. To get more specific though, I don't believe that freedom is even a real thing as an abstract concept. I believe that it's a completely meaningless term, and I believe that insisting that something be apolitical in the name of freedom is literally the most political thing that you can do. Now that I've got your attention, let me unpack this. Exhibit A. Freedom. Or rather, the nonsense and poppycock that is freedom as a concept. There is, as I said, no such thing as absolute freedom, because any freedom that an individual holds is necessarily the deprivation of another freedom held by somebody else. If you are given the freedom to walk on the lawn in front of my house because there is no sidewalk in front of my house, then I am necessarily deprived of the freedom to make you get off the lawn in front of my house. It works the other way too, really. If I deprive you of the freedom to murder people, that gives those people you want to murder the freedom to live, to exist, right? This is pretty basic dialectical thinking in reality, and if you're on board with this, you're already halfway to being a Marxist. I'll let you unpack that on your own time. So it goes without saying that this works for groups of people too. If I say, you aren't allowed to commit genocide, and exert power to prevent you from committing genocide, to take away your freedom of genocide, I am giving the freedom of your targeted population to live, and their culture to perpetuate. And since no human being is an island, and especially since we're talking here in terms of communities like the free and open source community, we're always talking about groups of people, right? This can be in terms of individual communities, subcultures, ethnicities, religions, nations. It doesn't matter. This dialectic of freedom on one hand and the restriction of freedom on the other hand is an unviolable constant. There is no freedom that exists without the loss of another freedom. So freedom in the abstract, that is, that a community or a philosophy can be more free than another one, is nonsense and poppycock. And this is where politics comes into it. A common line you'll often hear from targeted communities and their allies is, "Our identity is not political." That is, for example, it shouldn't be political to be gay. It isn't politics, it's who we are. You don't get to argue about whether or not I'm allowed to be gay because I am. You're arguing that I'm not allowed to be gay is arguing that I'm not allowed to exist, and that's not just your opinion, man. That's not what politics is. And I used to be somebody to say this line a whole lot, and while I still definitely appreciate the feelings and the morality behind it, it isn't really true, is it? Let's look at the definition of political. The most relevant definition here, right here, is probably the first definition, since we're not talking about somebody's profession, right? And the third definition is honestly begging the question. So when we're talking about politics, we're generally talking about the state and political power. Who has the power and what is being done with that power? And certainly those targeted groups can say that their right to simply exist and to be themselves has nothing at all to do with power. They aren't trying to take or use any systemic power over anyone else, but hear me out, because they are. Let's look back at our dialectics of freedom. If I, as a non-binary person, am asking for the freedom to exist, then I am necessarily depriving people who do not want me to exist of the freedom to end my existence. I am, in a very real way, taking away power from them and putting it, instead, with myself. I now have the power to protect my freedom to exist, and you no longer have the power to take away my freedom to exist. So this is political in a very real and literal way. And considering this, there isn't really all that much out there that isn't political, and indeed, necessarily, any time at all that we're talking about freedom, we are necessarily talking about politics. So we're at kind of a weird place. We have Vaxry here saying that, 1, freedom in the abstract means that he can run his community however he wants, which includes allowing the community to discriminate against LGBT people. And that 2nd, arguing against this is now making the situation political. It would not be political if people just adhere to this abstract freedom of his. So now we can tear this apart. We can see how absurd it is. If Vaxry has the freedom to deny someone their identity within a community, that deprives that individual of the freedom to have their identity within that community. And as this is directly pertaining to who has power and who can exercise that power over whom, it is already political. Political on a small scale, certainly, but no smaller a scale than the other way around. That is, Free Desktop having the freedom to no longer associate with Vaxry takes away Vaxry's freedom to associate with Free Desktop. The FOSS community's freedom to tell Vaxry he's being a douchebag and to not deal with him anymore if he doesn't stop takes away Vaxry's freedom to be a douchebag. It's all power moving from one end of the dialectic to the other. But to Vaxry, it's only political if that power is moving away from him. And this is why you can't just be a centrist. There's no such thing as being apolitical. You can't just want the most freedom for everyone, because freedom is a dialectic. It's a zero-sum game. The reality is, most people who say they want the most freedom for everyone are going to be people who want the most freedom for the most visible groups. And this isn't anything malicious. Obviously, if you see more people who have more freedom, you're going to think that there's more freedom to go around, and you've got a more free society. But in reality, you're just giving those groups who are already quite powerful, already visible, still more power. And in your centrism, you're actually contributing to the oppression of already oppressed groups. So you do have to pick a side. And I hope you'll pick the side that empowers the disempowered, that recognizes the dialectics of power and freedom, and wants to move that power and freedom towards those groups that do not have it. That's what we mean when we're talking about equality, and hopefully, with a greater understanding of the concept, about freedom.